Allowing me to present, asking me to do so on such a very important topic, something that we all face in every single classroom we're in, whether it's special education or regular education. I have a tendency to really float away from my notes and get off task, so I'm going to do as much as I can to stick straight to the script. It may sound a little canned, but believe me, it'll be worth it. And I will have my reading glasses hanging off my nose. Try not to be distracted by that. Without further ado, you do see from my outline that number 2 is recognition of past CLC presentations on this topic. And there has been a wide gamut of information covered in the past on learning disorders, their etiologies, classroom accommodations, and so on. Some of the information is outdated, but most of it is really quite relevant still today. And of course, the Word of God that is infused through all of them is 100% relevant. Given the plethora of information on this topic, broad-based topic, I decided to really focus on those past papers and review what our predecessors have already quite capably shared. Some of you may have been present for some of those presentations. Many of us have not. If you've seen any of them, well, repetition is the mother of learning, which my students get tired of hearing me say, but it's so true. So we'll be taking a look at those as well as any additional information and resources that I've found in current research and educational trends. The focus is going to be on identifying learning disabilities, implementing classroom accommodations, and recognizing if and when to seek the help of outside sources. This is what I hope to avoid. And if I wouldn't have crossed out half of my notes, we would have been here until tomorrow. So there are going to be a lot of areas in which I'm scratching the surface. But I have in my notes and in all of those past papers places for you to go to. Come to me later on if you want further information or more in-depth explanation of any of those points. So the other thing about this is I absolutely cannot stand PowerPoints in which the presenter reads exactly what's on the slides. So what's on the slides is somewhat skeletal as well, and you can take notes and be active learners by listening to the extra information that I give about each. Here are all of those past papers that relate to this topic. There are 19 of them, dating from 1959 to 2010. One topic that's become of interest to me lately is number 12, the gifted child. I'm not going to be speaking much about that, but you'll notice it was given in 1959. So I would like to see this topic addressed by conference sometime in the future, and I already put that on the slip. But in the meantime, if you go follow these steps, you will find that paper, and it has timeless information about how to avoid some detrimental pitfalls when working with gifted students. The average student actually has the better chance of being invisible, but these gifted students a lot of times can fly under the radar as well and not perform to their personal best or PB. So we need to watch out for them. It would be worth your time to go and find this presentation and spend some time with it. But on to specific learning disabilities. According to the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, the umbrella term of learning disabilities is probably quite narrow compared to what you may be thinking. What it does not include, number one, are students with IQs below 70, or that have significant limitations in such things as self-care, self-direction, functional academic skills, health and safety, those sorts of things. Sensory impairments and autism spectrum disorders actually do not fall under that umbrella term either, but we will be discussing them a bit later because we do have students with this in our classrooms. And the third, these students would probably be called the emotional behavioral disabilities, the EBD students. There's always behavioral issues in our classroom. Some of these students, though, in order to be labeled, if you will, have significant issues that cause blocks to their learning, if you will. But what we are dealing with are 2.4 million school-aged children that do fall under the label of specific learning disabilities. This stat, however, does not include private, religious, and homeschool students. So there's more. And of course, we're seeing a lot of that. What are they then? These students have significant issues that will affect the abilities in number one there. But oftentimes, they are of average or above average intelligence. However, for some reason or another, there is something that is impacting their ability to perform in the classroom. They are also lifelong disabilities, so the earlier they can be detected, the earlier you can begin accommodating and hopefully circumvent or overcome the challenges that would be presented to them throughout their academic careers. Thirdly, many of these students have parents or relatives with similar difficulties. There may have, other than hereditary, there may have been illnesses or injury during pregnancy, drug and alcohol use during pregnancy, lack of oxygen, and so on. Or even shortly after birth, head injuries or poor nutrition or exposure to toxins. Lastly, learning disabilities actually includes the following labels. This is a crude reference chart. There's so many more details involved with each of these disabilities, and we'll be getting into that to some extent throughout this presentation. But when narrowed down, you'll see that a lot of the disabilities that we encounter in the classroom aren't actually on this chart or under that umbrella term of learning disabilities. They fall into other disabilities categories. So therefore, I will be covering autism, spectrum disorders, EBD, other health impairments, visual and auditory impairments as well that we encounter in our classrooms. But fortunately, many of the accommodations and identification methods for learning disabilities apply to the other disabilities as well. Oops. So how do we figure out who's struggling, right? It may be hard, really, just by looking at the student, and it would be a lot easier if they would come in with a sign on them like this, but they don't. So we go through set to trying to figure out if there is a learning disability, and if so, what. Now, for the sake of sanity and time, I'm not going to be going through all of the identification processes for each disability, but rather give you the links and tools, checklists, warning signs, and information that's necessary to know which tendencies a student may be portraying. So in Appendix A, you will find links to find more information about all of these disabilities. ADHD, other than the hyperactivity, which is the most obvious characteristic, these students may be slow to process information, struggle with following instructions, have trouble completing homework, become bored easily, have a lack of organization. However, ADD students have all of those things, and that was just a short list of characteristics of ADHD and ADD students, but there's a danger with these ADD students. Since they don't have the hyperactivity, they can perhaps be fly under the radar. They can have legitimate focus issues, but perhaps be mislabeled as stubborn or lazy or spacey. So it's very important not to overlook them. And there is information in Appendix A for identifying them as well. Dyslexia, sometimes called the hidden disability, because it's not necessarily just letter reversals. It's not even necessarily just trouble with reading. It can be writing, math, and spelling as well. And each of those have their own unique characteristics that can be found through following links in Appendix A. Auditory processing disorders. There are 4 types, and this really starts to sound overwhelming, but hang in there a little bit. The 4 types include, and I'm just going to rattle them off: auditory discrimination, auditory figure ground discrimination, auditory memory, and auditory sequencing. Gets better. Visual processing disorders, there's 7 different types of that. And I'm not even going to attempt rattling through those. Oh, just for fun, maybe. Visual motor processing, visual memory, visual closure, spatial relationships, visual sequencing, blah, 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 blah. Lots of different disorders. So honestly, how are we supposed to remember all of that and address it? My head's spinning, maybe for other reasons, but what do we do? Well, fortunately, in general, when you have a student that's performing below their ability, and while each disability has their own unique characteristics, they also have a lot in common. So if you take a look at handouts, number 1 and 2, those should be in the right pocket of your folders. That's a couple of general learning disability checklists. If you go through, if you look at some of those, you probably have students popping into your head right away. But if you fill one of them out and you find that there's a student is exhibiting such things and it's problematic enough, then you can go back and consider a little more specifically what might be going on with that student and take a look at some of these other checklists to narrow down what exactly is going on with them, because it makes a big difference in which accommodations are going to work with those students. Questions? I forgot to mention, if you have any, he'll be watching for you and alert me, and I can stop and address those at any point. So the other disabilities that don't actually fall under the umbrella of specific learning disabilities, according to the Wisconsin DPI, autism. And autism prevalence has dramatically increased in the last 2 to 3 years. This has been credited really to increased awareness and diagnoses of individuals that are on the spectrum but have possibly above average intelligence, if that makes sense. So a lot of these students that have been not diagnosed in the past would be perhaps these Asperger's syndrome's children. By definition, and again, I have a lot of specific information about both of these disabilities in my notes, but for sake of time, I'm just going to stay on the surface. But if you're going to be comparing Asperger's with full-blown autism, typically the Asperger's symptoms are realized later in life. Did I say that right? Yeah. Autism usually is detectable by the time the child is 2 or 3 years old, whereas Asperger's isn't realized until later. More often, the Asperger's students will benefit more from special education, which would lead them into a more normal, if you will, adult life, marriage and children, social relationships, competitive employment. These students also have less severe social and communication deficits, so they may fit in more, but still they're sort of the quirky kids, and they can fall prey to bullying, so that's one thing that we need to really be careful and watch for with them. Their verbal abilities are usually more highly developed, and so I had a conversation with Mr. Schaller about how a while back ADHD seemed to be the thing that was being labeled and diagnosed all of the time. And we were wondering if that, because it's a catchphrase sort of thing now, if more kids are just getting labeled with autism spectrum disorder. And I don't believe that's the case. I just believe that many of them never were identified as such and received the help they needed because they did have average to above average intelligence. And people just thought they were quirky, right? But they can definitely benefit from our empathy and our accommodations. Moving on to emotional behavioral. Oftentimes we don't see students that are severe enough to have a label in our classrooms. Sometimes we do. They exhibit social and behavioral functioning that so departs from the generally accepted cultural norms that it adversely affects their academic performance and classroom adjustment. And again, these checklists and tools for identification are on Appendix B. You probably all caught that already, but other health impairments, we see these students in our classrooms all the time as well, whether they have heart problems, diabetes, leukemia, degenerative conditions. All of these things, for some reason or another, may be affecting their ability to perform in class as well, even if it's extended absences due to hospital stays. There's also checklists for hearing and visual impairments, which, as I put up there, may seem self-explanatory, but as far as eligibility criteria, there's more to it than that. And I'm not sure if any of us really need to get into that, but the information is there for you in case you want to have some questions about a student of yours. So, that's clear as mud. We all struggle with something. And it certainly can seem overwhelming to think about meeting all of our students' needs that could all have some degree of learning disability. Fortunately, as Christians, we have the greatest source of strength. And I have the fruits of the Spirit on my little mobile teaching unit that I go around daily with, because I need constant reminders of them. Also, with a little bit of humor, I usually point out that in many versions of Scripture, patience is actually referred to as long-suffering. I find it a little bit humorous, but Also a good reminder of what that involves. Also posted on my desk, or by my desk at school, is a quote from Chaim Gano. He was a school teacher, or he is, I believe he's still alive, child psychologist, school teacher. And while I haven't studied him in depth, and I'm not promoting any of his works necessarily, I find this quote to be quite profound. Take a moment on that. So, knowing all of these things, though, does not necessarily lead us to act in the student's best interest. We need to be empathetic in order to be tirelessly motivated to work for the sake of these students. And I'm going to apologize in advance because this might be difficult technologically for me to do. But I'm going to go through some simulations of autism, ADHD, and dyslexia so that we get a better idea of what some of these students go through on a daily basis. And I just shut down instead of minimize my screen. Gasp. I certainly didn't think that would happen when I apologized ahead of time. Okay, back on track. Autism simulation. Do I have sound? Looks like I do. We should be hearing something though. It was working. So that's a bit distracting, but just notice that a typical person walking down the street doesn't have a lot of distractions visually or auditorily. But now we're going to be taking a look at the walk in the day, in the shoes of an autistic person. And I am going to turn this up to emphasize. Does go on for a bit, but again, just to see the stark contrast in just a quiet stroll down the street versus one in which the lighting is brighter, the sounds are louder, and everything is pulling your attention. Moving on to, and I do have a lovely assistant that agreed to help me out with this one. This is going to be giving us sort of an example of what it may be like with ADHD. So you can come on up, and Jen is going to be
on your desk. You should have shapes and a grid. We're going to play a game now,
directions.
Shapes and colors. When we're done, we'll all have formed a secret picture. Make sure you listen to my instructions or your picture won't look like it's supposed to. Are we doing art? No, Freddie. Art class was yesterday. Here we go. I'm only saying the directions once, so don't ask me to repeat them. Listen carefully. Ready? Everyone take the yellow triangle and put it on the yellow circle in the grid.
I don't have a yellow triangle.
Is that yours on the floor? Now find the green square. It belongs on the red square. Look at the blue triangle on the grid. Put the green circle on it.
Which circle?
Don't put the red square on the yellow triangle.
But I already knew the yellow triangle.
Arthur, put the green triangle on the red square.
Swim and
Smith had to go anywhere and
I think
left to get the yellow.
Arthur had to go to the nursery.
Hey, everyone needs to settle down and pay attention, or no one's going to get this right. There's something no square with the red circle. Put the blue triangle on the spot below the green square you can see. Put the red triangle over the yellow shape.
Is that a trick question?
Put the yellow circle on the last empty space. Is everyone done? Flip your card over.
So we'll see how Jen did. Flip the card.
Does yours look like this?
Not quite. I had done that so many times practicing that it just wouldn't have been the same effect as having her come up cold turkey. Thank you for that. So that would be a simulation of an ADHD student trying to accomplish a task. And now dyslexia. And you can see you'll need a pen and a piece of paper handy because this is something you will be doing. Okay, here we go.
This one here, you're going to need a pen and a piece of paper. Make sure you have those two items. Here are the directions. You're going to copy down the text which follows on the screen. Use the opposite hand to which you usually write. You should complete the task within.
Oops.
Pause the video and time yourself as you go through it. So here we go.
Okay, so basically what he said is you're going to be timed. You'll have 2 minutes, but since we are quite a learned group, I'm only giving us a minute and a half. Don't start yet. And you need to use your opposite hand. If you're right-handed, use your left hand, and vice versa.
Pause the video.
And
Did you find?
you need to transcribe what's written.
Copy down the text which follows on the screen.
Told you there'd be issues with this.
I'll leave it up to you.
Where am I?
The directions. You're going to copy one here. You're going to need a pen and a piece of paper. Here are the directions. You're going to copy.
Just get me to the screen.
To which you should complete the task within 2 minutes.
Should I be patient?
I'll leave it up to you to pause the video and time yourself as you go through.
I have a hard time being patient. Okay, so now transcribe what's on the screen with your opposite hand. You have a minute and a half. No visiting, ladies. Okay, this isn't hard, people. Why are you staring at me like you don't know what's going on? All you have to do is transcribe what's on the board. It's been over 30 seconds, so I hope you're halfway done at least. Ross Rail, pay attention.
You wrote that in your script because I'm paying attention. You had that already ahead of time, didn't you? I knew it.
30 seconds.
I was until you called my name. Now I'm not concentrating.
If you wouldn't have been visiting with me, you'd have been done by now.
I don't think so.
Ten seconds. Don't quit. You can finish it still. All right, stop. So, oftentimes we put our students under a time limit, and some of these students are asked to do something that's almost virtually impossible for them. And not only do we make it worse with time limits, but we hound them. Like I was hounding you, you know. But it was a difficult task. And for a lot of these students, it is as difficult as writing with your opposite hand. And how do you transcribe something that's in such an unfamiliar language and spelling? But for these students, it's like that every day with common words that they've been seeing for years, but they aren't able to process. They also have problems listening and writing at the same time. And as I mentioned, a lot of times we'll get on their case for it, and that only exasperates the situation. So hopefully through that you have gotten just a little bit more of understanding of how frustrating that would be within a day's time. Also, I wanted to call attention to an archived presentation down at the bottom there, in which Dr. Grant Martin was quoted from his book, The Hyperactive Child. If you were set out to design a situation that was most contrary to the needs and abilities of an LD student, you would probably come up with the typical classroom. So, what do we do within the classroom to promote learning to the best of our students' abilities? Well, there are accommodations and there are modifications, and there are differences between them. A very common accommodation would be preferential seating. A common modification may be different but supplemental textbooks. The danger in confusing these two, first of all, if you make modifications, you may be changing the target skill, the expected learning outcome. So therefore, you'll end up with incorrect assumptions about what the student truly knows. Assignments and tests completed with modifications cannot be graded the same way as those completed with accommodations. Accommodations are simply meant to level the playing field, but not to give an undue advantage. Second, if we provide students with modifications rather than accommodations, we're more than likely to change or reduce our expectations for them without necessarily intending to do so.
Would an accommodation be reading a test to a student?
Yes.
That would be accommodation.
Yes, because you're not changing what they're expected to produce in the end.
10 division problems instead of 30? Which would you call that?
If the 10 are indicative of all of the skills being taught in that lesson or in that unit, whatever it may be.
Then you'd call that an accommodation.
Correct. But it would be a modification if you simply cut the test or assignment in half and they may not actually be working on a particular skill within that lesson or unit. Does that make sense?
Are you saying, it sounds like you're saying you shouldn't do modifications.
If we're doing modifications, there may be need to refer for special education or education elsewhere. And we'll be getting into that. We should be doing mostly accommodations. If we do modifications, and this might be a little repetitive because I am getting to this, but I want to address it now. Everybody needs to be super aware and on the same page, especially parents and any other schools that these students may be transferring to or graduating into, as far as how they're being graded and whether or not in the end they're at grade level. Yes?
One more.
Mhm.
High school students, they have a test the next day. I send the test home with them to study with their parents before they take it the next day.
That's an accommodation.
Giving a student half of the spelling words, accommodation or modification?
That's a problem. If the entire spelling list is really focused on a specific phonetic skill, perhaps, and all of the words that you give them have that, then you could shorten it. But if the words may have different, like phonetic, or different consonant blends that they're working on, and you shorten it, and therefore they don't get the CH words or whatever, then that's a modification, and they're not learning the same thing. Do we have another one here? Mr. Schaller?
So maybe every other is better than the first 10?
Yeah, but you still need to assess that to make sure that they are getting the target skills. So finally, another thing to watch out for is by providing modifications instead of accommodations, we could be limiting the student's opportunities to learn and possibly contribute to learned helplessness. I have more examples in my notes about some subtle differences in accommodations and modifications, and I'd be happy to go into that later as well. But before I go on to learned helplessness, it is important to identify what those target skills are so that whatever you're doing to help the student reach them is still focused on them, on the target skills, rather than changing their end outcome. If that makes sense. Because if the modified tasks were graded the same as accommodated tasks, it would not be a valid picture of the student's ability. And parents also need to be very aware of that so that they have realistic expectations. So I mentioned sometimes with the modifications, it can lead to learned helplessness if you are expecting less from them than they could possibly maybe do. This past presentation is full of fabulous scriptures and what to and how to problem solve. And again, I have more specifics in my notes, but I need to skim over that. I tell my students, we can't all be mathematicians. We can't all be authors. Whatever it is that you're good at, let's focus on that. But then figure out a way how to get you the best that you can be in the other classes. So we also need to watch out as ourselves. Have you ever felt like giving up on a student? Like the effort is not bringing forth any gain, so why try? I mean, I found literally hundreds of verses that will encourage and strengthen teachers, but these following also focus on the outcome for our students. Galatians 6:9, and let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. Matthew 5:16, in the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Matthew 18:12, what do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? So sometimes it seems like so much extra effort to go after that one lost one, but that's what we're called to do. So now that we're inspired by Scripture, let's have a little bit of comic relief before we get back to accommodations and modifications. Maybe you've seen this one before. Can you guys read that? Kind of an ironic cartoon. Another one here that just emphasizes all of the confusing abbreviations and acronyms that go along with special education. And this is my favorite. Isn't that funny? Come on. It's quirky, I know, and maybe not 100% appropriate, but. All right, trying to avoid death by PowerPoint. Getting back to common modifications. I'm going to discuss them first because they are what we should actually not be doing as often. So it should be a shorter conversation. If we find that we're modifying, then there are special considerations, as we touched on. But first, some of the common modifications are listed here. So if we find ourselves doing that, modifying assignments and curricula, we need to consider these three things. And I did touch on them earlier, but is grading being done correctly? Are we comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges? Our assessments of growth may not be able to be done with standardized testing. We may need to use more anecdotal measures of growth. Say a writing sample from the beginning of the quarter to a writing sample at the end of the quarter. These kids are not going to show growth on standardized tests as their peers, but are they making growth for themselves? Secondly, are the parents fully aware of expectations and grading interpretation? Some of them may have unrealistic expectations. If you're providing modifications and grading them, giving them A's or B's, you're allowing them usually a lot of, to get away with things sometimes. And the parent may think, oh, they're doing fine. In a regular classroom, they're getting a B. But you know that they're not actually performing the same as the other students in your class. Lastly, should this student be referred? This is going to be addressed more at the end of the presentation if I ever get to the end of it. Are we providing the service expected and needed? Is the student showing growth at all? And what will happen to the student at the next level or at the next school? We need to have very good communication with the next school where the student would probably have an IEP, or it could reflect poorly on our CLC schools. And I'll get more into that as well later. So let's move on to accommodations. They fall into these following categories, and there's a list in Appendix C of a bunch of common modifications. And it's huge, but it is incomplete, Appendix C. Because oftentimes, we teachers, accommodations are kind of born out of necessity in the classroom at that moment with a specific student's need. And you'll find, if you look at some of those things, that really effective teachers sometimes instinctively know and implement these things. But this list may include things that you haven't thought of before. And either way, it's a good reminder and a tool to have available. So take some time and look that over for maybe some ideas you haven't thought of using in your classroom before. Past papers, I tell you, those archives are a gold mine. A lot of accommodations that are still relevant today. Notice that 3 of them are specific to reading. The first one has great tips for teachers, including consistency, working within a student's attention span, not taking their behavior personally. The second one has presentation strategies, including proximity to the student, eye contact, preparing students with class agendas, preparing them for transition times, things like that. The fourth one really goes into positive and negative reinforcement and how to introduce students to situations where they're most likely to be successful, and then build up their confidence, and then build on the complexity of skills that they're to learn. Number 5, the fifth one, has great specific accommodations for such things as writing and composition, math accommodations, also research project accommodations, ideas. So dig into those old-time papers. All of the accommodations, how do we choose and use them wisely? I'm going to just take a moment to talk specifically about Asperger's and autism. A lot of this is very specific to them, but certain things can be applied to all LD students. Handouts 3 and 4 are full of these things, but primarily you're looking at using, number 1, reinforcement systems that are specific to the students. Not every student is motivated by the same activities. Some might need some downtime, some might need to listen to music, and they all need to know that what one is getting, the other one doesn't necessarily need. Okay? And they're good at adapting to that. I know some people are thinking, well, if I let them listen to music, then everybody's going to want to. The kids really are better at adapting to that than you think. So give each student what they need. The second one, these students may need very concrete language, not only for directions, but also for rules and consequences. They're very good with if, then, and cause and effect relationships. Third, use fixations to your advantage. If you have a autistic Asperger's syndrome that is fixated on horses, say, let them use that in their writing prompt or math problems. Whatever it is, we're going to get better results. I guarantee that. Sensory breaks. Some kids need to move. Some kids need something to hold and squeeze, putty or stress balls. Some kids need weighted vests to calm them. Fifth, going back to the simple understanding of cause and effect, you need to have consistent and immediate rules with specific consequences. Sixth, we need to give these students sufficient notices of any changes in schedules. If you've ever worked with a truly autistic student, if you say we're going to do science, but switch the order up and go into literature instead, they will have a complete meltdown. You also need to give them adequate preparation for transitions. Seventh, as you saw in the video, there are things that can just really throw them off. If you have an activity planned that's highly sensory, maybe give them the option of doing something that's less stimulating. Classrooms also are so loud. I know our classrooms. The kids are lifting up the tops of their desks and banging them down. Sometimes maybe putting felt or some sort of buffer there so that they're not so loud. I've seen classrooms where they put tennis balls on the legs of chairs so that the chairs aren't as loud. Things like that. Moving on to the IEP. If any of you have read IEP goals, sometimes they can be ridiculous, and this is an example of one. Obviously, if Susie did not cross the street safely 10 out of 10 times, she could be dead, okay? But some of them can seem that ridiculous. So, individualized education plan. Of course, the formal decisions do need to be made with an IEP team, and sometimes in our schools that consists of any teachers that are working with the student, maybe the principal, maybe the parents, definitely the parents, that is. However, informal decisions need to be made on a daily basis. We need to be flexible and creative enough in our classrooms to recognize when something's not working and change it. Otherwise, it's insanity. Not every student is going to benefit from the same modification. One of the most popular accommodations, I messed up there. One of the most common accommodations is extended time. Well, that might not be what the student needs. So you have to match the accommodation with the student need. The third bullet point, to the extent possible and appropriate, let the student help you determine what works best for them. Aren't they the ones that kind of know the best? Some of them can handle making input about what's going to work for them in the class. Finally, more is not better when it comes to accommodations. Over-accommodating students is not helpful. It may actually depress their performance rather than improve it. The key, though, is once you find something to use, you need to be consistent, provide a lot of practice. Because if the student is not comfortable using the accommodation, it could just lead to confusion instead of being helpful. Oftentimes we use volunteers for implementation with some of these students. We do need to be aware of a few things. First bullet point, the volunteers need to help the students figure out rather than do for. And this is very important. And I have a million of ideas about how to do this, but not everyone knows how to help a student decode a word. There are ways to prompt that without telling them that CH makes the ch sound. You need to be able to prompt them to do that themselves. Second bullet point, no comment. I was a volunteer in one of my students' classes, and with one of my kids it worked, with one of the others it didn't. So you just see how that dynamic is, whether or not you can use a parent with their student in the room. Third bullet point, volunteers appreciate having a definite assignment rather than a general direction, such as go over there and help with reading. Perhaps you could instead say, listen to this child read aloud. Make a list of any words they're having difficulty with. Then you can go back later and target some decoding practice with that word or comprehension. Fourth, volunteers need to know what your disciplinary procedure is and whether or not they are expected to act on that or to defer to you. So, behavior management. I'm running low on time. When I was going to UWEC in the special education program, a lot of my regular ed friends said that they had very little to no instruction on behavior management. And currently, the UWEC website, you'll find that there's a 4-to-1 ratio for behavior management classes in special ed versus regular education classes. I found that these techniques work wonders with typically developing students, so why not use them? Because without them, any accommodations, modifications, or instructional methods are a moot point. 2 of our past papers address these things quite well. The ADHD paper talks about clearly stating what you do expect from a student, not saying what you don't. Talks about reinforcement programs. Talks about using specific praise rather than good job all the time. You know, I really like how you're sitting there listening right now instead of good job. The hyperactive children one highlights 5 psychoeducational techniques for helping LD students to relax, to attend and concentrate, to delay gratification, and improve achievement. So, worth your time, good resources. Additional resources, at this website, it contains links to at least 44 resources on behavior management. Just a few of the titles are Bully Proof Your Classroom, Conflict Resolution, Room Arrangement, Advice from Veteran Teachers. But here are some things we definitely do not want to do. The first one, we need to figure out what the function of the behavior is, because it's usually not random. If you have a student that's constantly throwing paper clips during reading time, well, perhaps the assignments are too long for them. Look at what's causing their behavior, which goes on to the next one. Don't ask them because you don't want to know what their answer is going to be. Use that old psychology method of ABC. Analyze the antecedent, then the behavior and its consequence. What's going on before the behavior and what are they getting out of it? And then you can manipulate that. Number 4. We may actually end up violating our own classroom rules often, unless we keep them few and simple, but encompassing many other sub-rules. So for example, one rule could be respecting classmates. Well, that encompasses not stealing pencils, not name-calling, not throwing paper clips, etc. And then we need to follow through consistently, which is tough. But it needs to be at the fore of our mind. Follow through consistently or they're going to have little effect. 5, remember that sometimes these students actually cannot control their behaviors without more comprehensive intervention, or maybe not at all. 6, this is often overlooked but can save a lot of time and frustration, especially with students that are rigid in their routine, that don't handle free time very well. We need to give them warnings, we need to prepare them for transitions, share our expectations with them. 7, ignoring can be a very valuable tool, but it needs to be paired with attention to when they are doing something correct. So simply ignoring the fact that Johnny just threw a paperclip at me, well, I wouldn't ignore that. That's an attention-seeking behavior. You need to address that. But look for times when they're doing the desired behavior and give them attention for that. Ignore some other things that aren't immediately attention-seeking. 10, skipping down a bit, never go it alone. Take the time for brainstorming, for support and encouragement with parents and other professionals, even the students themselves. 11, at times lessons can actually be so easy or so difficult or ineffective and non-stimulating that it actually leads to student misbehavior. And I actually ran across some references that in research that there are some learning disabilities that are actually caused by teacher ineffectiveness. Think about that though. Of course, you're not going to take their behavior personally. The goal though is always to get students to self-regulate. The scope, how to do this is way beyond the scope of this paper, but we need to get them to increase their expectations of their own behavior. We need to decrease their need for external rewards and get them to intrinsically be rewarded by doing the right thing. So they aren't always looking to us to reward them for doing something. And again, I do have a behavior management technique that I worked out when I was working with autistic students in the Eau Claire district, and I can share that program with anybody that's interested. Last slide, but it's a long one. Actually, it's not the last either. When to go to outside sources. This can be as simple as collaboration, right? As I mentioned, we can't go it alone. Look for support from others within our field. And if you look at handout 5, which right now isn't much, but at one point it was a pretty complete list of resources within the CLC that Mrs. Ryan was a part of putting together back in 2010. I already took off some names that I knew would not be available, and I added myself. But if you know of anybody who is willing to still be a resource for us in these areas, jot them in, and you can hand that sheet in at the table sometime too. I can compile that list again and make sure that everyone gets that. So that's kind of our homework, if you have any ideas of resources to put on there. This could also include referral for special education or for the students to seek education elsewhere. If you've gone through the informal assessments that we talked about way at the beginning of the presentation, you've gone through checklists, you've determined that the student is in need of perhaps more than you can offer, go to your district special education department and refer them. It gets to that point. As far as seeking education elsewhere, it's my opinion that we should consider these 5 bullet points first, because they were highlighted in this past presentation. I believe that these 5 objectives are the top objectives of all education. Self-realization. We do want the students, we need the students to operate at the best of their personal ability, right? So if we can't bring them to that point, we may not be doing them much good, okay? They also need to be able to relate with other humans, obviously, and be economically independent. It'd be great for them to have some sort of civic community responsibility, to be responsible adults in the future sometime. And of course, the indoctrination of the word, we know, is the most important objective in education, because Proverbs 9:10 states, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." Because without these 5 things, what do we have? You may have an incredibly intelligent person, but without these things, possibly danger. After all, Hitler was a genius. So, after considering these 5 things, is it time to refer? Well, I looked back at this past presentation, and it was a lot of very similar concepts on when to hold a student back, as with if you should refer them. It was suggested that holding certain students back may not actually be beneficial. Some of those students could be ones with poor self-image, students with unsupportive parents, students that are unmotivated. There's a whole list. They might not actually thrive anywhere else as well. So we would want to keep them, actually. My complete notes go into that a little bit more as well. So, but for various reasons, referral to education elsewhere may not be in their best interest unless the parents are expecting them to be performing at grade level versus their own personal best. And unless we as a school are unable to document any academic growth at all, even with subjective anecdotal measures. Because again, these students will be transferring to another school at some point. And if they haven't had a formal IEP, the other schools are going to be like, what? The student had A's and B's at their last school and they're reading at a 3rd grade level when they're a freshman? What are these CLC schools teaching? So, again, it may be best if we know that we are not moving them forward in any manner to refer. Also, lastly, effectiveness in the classroom. If there's so much disruption to learning because of a particular student that it's affecting the growth of all of the others, it just cannot happen. All right, clear as mud, right? This is the last slide, I promise. Looking for a little bit of humor with this clear as mud thing because there's so much information, right? What I hope that you got out of this, though, is at least where to find resources when you have needs. And again, we don't always know what our little part is playing. We're not seeing the bigger picture. And I love that Bible verse at the bottom. We may have quite an effect on these students in the long run, whether we know it or not. So, if we remain faithful and don't grow weary. What I do also hope I got through, perhaps, is some encouragement and comfort, strength, maybe even some joy, collaboration in facing and enduring these challenges that we're going to face in our classrooms. So again, thank you for allowing me to present. I think we have like 4 minutes.
We can talk a little bit longer. I anticipate quite a few questions. There's a little bit of time. But before I open it up to questions, I neglected to properly introduce Lori. I don't know how many of you know her, but she obviously is very qualified by her presentation, but I just wanted to read her introduction. She has a Bachelor of Science in Communication Disorders and a Master of Arts in Audiology from Western Michigan. Also certification in Early Childhood Special Education from UWEC, and is licensed by Wisconsin for that, and has worked as a special ed aide in the Eau Claire School District for 6 years and a substitute early childhood special education in the district. So with that, any questions or comments?
Ross?
If I'd have known all that, I would have paid closer attention. No, I'm kidding.
Sorry.
I saw you had a lot of links there. Are they actually links on your PowerPoint?
Yes, if you
Will
access
be
my...
putting that in the online file folder then?
Yes.
Because I think this is really something that we needed. We weren't going to be able to absorb a lot of, here's what you do in these specific cases, but having places to go to when you suspect, I think is going to be really helpful. I did have a question on modifications. It seemed like you were kind of steering us away from those, but what if you've decided that a student is definitely not as capable as other students? Accommodations aren't going to do it. Modifications sometimes are going to be what are necessary. And it seems like if you've got that in their school file that we used modifications with this student, then when they move on, it will be understood that maybe they did get B's with the modifications. If they had been with the rest, it wouldn't have been that. Is that?
Exactly, as long as it's documented clearly that way, and as long as the parents have that knowledge and clearly understand that. And many of our parents, fortunately, their priority is education of the soul. And so they are okay with those modifications and the fact that their student may never operate at grade level. Yes?
Nathan?
To a soccer coaching clinic, and the guy who's in charge of it, I liked his demonstration, the visual of it. He took I know it's soccer, he took a jump rope, and he held it up about 1.5 feet, and said, okay, everybody jump over it. All right? And then he held it up to about 3.5 feet. Well, a lot of people couldn't do that. And instead, he said, okay, somebody go to the other end, and you put one end, and he raised it up to about 5 feet, and the other one at 1 foot. He said, go ahead and jump over it where you can jump over it at. Now, train the kids to jump over where they're at, and then gradually they can lift it up. The thing is, it's not going to be a level jump rope. It's always going to be something that are better. And I agree with Ross, and that's sort of my thought process too is in the classroom. You know, I might have a second, third, and fourth grader all in the same math class. I guess that's a modification. You know, it's where they're at, and they're going to go up as they show it. Now you're going to push them. You're going to try to get them to achievement and maybe get back to grade level, we'll call it. But and maybe they'll even exceed it at some point. But, yeah.
It's interesting because throwing in different grade levels is a whole other factor. But as far as the student's age and what is typically expected in their development, you look at whether or not you can accommodate and help them to learn those standards, or if you need to modify and change the goals for that student.
Some of my kids coming up, I just feel, you know what, when they're done with 8th grade, they've got what they got, in a sense. And we sure hope that's a higher level, or the 8th grade level. But I think the parents are also aware of it. I tell them this is where they're at. This is the next step they're going to take. No, I won't say it. Okay.
I had one question. You mentioned that ABC, when you're talking about behavior management. Could you just go into that a little bit? I kind of missed what you had said just briefly.
You need to take a look at what is occurring before an undesired behavior happens, the antecedent, what's causing it. And then on the other end of that, what the student is getting out of it. You can manipulate circumstances if you know what's causing the behavior. And also you can manipulate what the student's getting out of it. If they are getting attention, whether it's negative or positive, they may like that, and they'll continue to do so. If it's at the front end of it, if they are always melt down during a spelling test, how can you change the format, perhaps, of the spelling test in order to avoid a meltdown? Or take it at home, maybe. How do you manipulate the things that cause the behavior, the antecedent, and how do you not reinforce it on the other side, reinforce that behavior?
Ross?
When I was here in Fond du Lac, I remember we had to do an IEP for a student. I think it was Naomi. No, I'm kidding. It wasn't you, Naomi. We had to do an IEP, and after we got through the whole process and what would be good for the student, the teacher in charge of the IEP, the special ed rep, said a school like yours is the best place for a student like this, because it was a low student-teacher ratio, and it was more quiet than a public school. And with most of these disabilities that you're talking about, since you're not talking about severely handicapped and so on, are small schools like ours going to be one of the best places for most of these kinds of students?
Trying to find a quote that I left out of my presentation because of time. But basically, it is my opinion, without statistics to back it up, that the students in our environments can thrive more so than the stagnation that I've seen in some special education classrooms because of lower expectations there, because of so many behavioral problems, distractions, and of course, because of the inability to use God's Word. So I do see them growing to their personal best.
Which means we all need to be willing to take a resource like this and get to the spots we need to get to, find out what we need to know to help the students out.
Especially if the parents are there with that understanding and that their priority is education of the soul. Sometimes we find parents from the community coming in because it's not necessarily the Christian education they're looking for, but they're looking for smaller classrooms and quality education. And they're more focused on, perhaps, getting their student to grade level or academic achievement of some level. And if you're working with parents like that, you really need to educate them on taking their student to their personal best, rather than meeting educational benchmarks, perhaps.
Mary, or did you have a follow-up?
Just follow up on that.
Sure.
But if you're the only teacher in the school of 14 or 15, and you have a couple of students who need extra attention, is it fair, do you think, in your opinion, to ask the parents to be willing to donate some time, if possible, if they're not working, come to school and help out?
Totally.
Mary?
So if we recognize the need, any of us, with any child, and we start doing accommodations, I mean, the next step we really have to ask ourselves as a school, all the way up through high school, is are we as a staff doing the best we can to communicate to each other the accommodations or modifications for this individual child? I mean, I would assume, just like there's many viewpoints in this room here, that there's different styles of teaching, there's different styles and levels of awareness of special needs, and I can see it being a real frustration to a student if he's getting certain accommodations in one class and then he switches teachers and then there's no accommodations. This could be a stepping stone for another presentation next year to, okay, how do you share this information all the way up through high school and work with the parents and the staff and multiple teachers to communicate the specific needs, kind of like we don't have IEPs within the CLC just for our small group of teachers that I know of. Or I guess you know what I'm asking.
Well, it's a good point. There needs to be that collaboration, and we perhaps should come up with written documentation to pass on with the student from grade to grade, as well as perhaps before the school year meeting with the next teacher or next school. But awareness of this plethora of disabilities is so important. And then again, like I said, not just the awareness that they're there and that they affect far more students than you even realize, but the empathy to get in their shoes.
Just to follow up, I mean, as a parent of a special needs child, well, I only had dyslexia, I mean, I physically went and talked to every teacher in a manual. But had that not happened, I don't think many of them possibly would have found out, because she was kind of like mainstream, kind of blended in there. But, you know, it's not everybody would feel comfortable going and talking to an individual teacher, or maybe they can't, or they don't feel like they're comfortable doing that. And so I feel like we should be more aggressive as staff members and teachers to have what you call this documentation that's more standardized for our CLC, so that's familiar. You know, kids coming in from all these different grade schools. Oh, here it is. Here's a yellow copy in their file. We've got some accommodations that work, and this is a red flag student, so we can help them the best we can.
It would certainly be beneficial to the student and the teacher.
And excuse me if there's something already in place. I don't mean to be knocking on any school or anyone, but I just think it's something that we have a lot of these talks. We have a lot of these presentations. Yours was excellent, Lori. I would really like to see now this take the next step where we have something in the file that really sticks and stands out that we are consistent on.
I've got 3 more speakers. We, as far as the schedule goes, we had 2:15 as the time to introduce you to Title V's and explain those and let you view those. And then we got our break and our group picture. Just letting you know, the Title V introductions, some don't have anything to say. So we have a little bit of wiggle room there, but just wanted to keep you aware of the agenda. Ross, you were next.
Is Joel on your list? Because if he is, he might be going to say what I want to say.
Joel's not on my list, unless I missed him.
Okay, well, I'm going to use you, Matt, as an example. We had a student this year that came up, and Matt sent a rather detailed letter along with that student's records that said these are the kinds of things that we've been doing with this student that seem to work well. In some cases, we've gotten students come up that struggle mightily, and we didn't know anything about problems that they had. So we're seeing both sides of that, but it's extremely helpful when someone does what Matt did. for us at Amanda.
Sarah?
A lot of our students go, well, pretty much all at this point, go on to local public and private schools. And since I sometimes don't have interaction with the schools, with the high schools, equipping especially our junior high kids to advocate for themselves seems to be a pretty important step for them, since they don't necessarily have parents who will go in for them like Mary did, or a teacher that can communicate what needs to be done, or maybe a note gets put in the file, but who knows if it gets seen. So, I mean, I'm still trying to figure out how to do that
Right.
well, but I think that's a really important step for the kids to be able to say, hey, I'm dyslexic, and I was wondering if we could talk about, how I might get some help for that.
I agree. As a matter of fact, I just read an article about dyslexia and how the students taking ownership of that title, even at a very early age, is so beneficial for them. Because a lot of the students are of above average intelligence. So they realize, okay, I'm not dumb. I am a smart person, I just can't read, or whatever it is. And so, yes, teaching them to self-advocate is always incredibly important. I just hope that the adults would listen.
Carl?
An IEP, or now they're calling it an ISP for the non-public schools, follows a kid to college. Everybody has to go by it. It's a legal document. It's binding. You have to do it. All the modifications are in there. They're changed every year. We usually have, I don't know, 5 or 6 kids out of the elementary age, and the district comes in. That's the deal with an ISP. It's greatly reduced services, but the district still has to provide some service. And once or twice we've had to recommend that kids go to public school if they wanted to get the full daily sessions with a sped teacher. And a lot of those kids end up with a para, small groups. And we just don't have that manpower. We also realize that religious training is not going to happen in public school. And one parent told us, you mean you can't find a way to teach my daughter and get her to pass? Well, we made modifications too. And we knew we were letting somebody end up with a high school diploma that was really not their grades weren't reflective of her accomplishments, but we note on the high school report cards, or any report card, that, especially high school, that modifications were made in assignments or assessments. So you have to work with the district to do that. And there's it takes them forever to test and have these meetings, and it always adds to everybody's workload. That will follow them throughout their career as a student, even in college, and that's how you track this. That's how you make it stick. And we have dropped the ball a few times by not passing on the IEPs to teachers who need it. That's our mistake. The system is there.
And speaking of not having the manpower within our small schools sometimes to follow through with accommodations, in Wisconsin, by law, and of course there's a loophole to this, but by law, the public schools are required to provide special education services in the private schools if the student does have an IEP. So technically, we should be able to utilize public school employees for special education services. But of course, there's a loophole to it that they can deny it. So it's there, but you can't use it. But other states may have that too, but you really have to fight for it. You really have to be assertive.
So Doug wanted to follow up on Carl.
Well, just one thing we found is that when, I think it's been 2 years now that they're calling it an ISP rather than an IEP. That's resulted in reduced services, it looks like. But a follow-up to the IEP following them post-secondary, what's really been impressed on us, in at least one case, we've seen it in action. Once they get to college, they have to advocate for themselves. There are offices and so on that will follow up, unlike through elementary and high school where these meetings, we get calls from the district and they say, our next meeting is scheduled for, and the team of us meet and so on. That doesn't happen in college. They have to advocate.
Joel?
I know at the beginning of your presentation you talked about the learning disabilities being lifelong. Do you see any of them, any of the students growing out of those disabilities or improving their ability to cope? And then also on the opposite side, do you see any of those disabilities maybe surface themselves, not until maybe high school or later on?
Yes to both. There are a lot of ADHD people where symptoms actually don't occur until adolescence or adulthood. I mean, that's one example. But yes, definitely with the right intervention, they will, an LD student or person may always struggle throughout life, but certainly improve far greater than without any intervention. As far as, miraculously being healed, it's not there though, but they can overcome their struggles quite capably.
I'm sorry, you have to introduce yourself again. I know Prof. Rail introduced you, but...
Andrew.
Andrew.
Yeah. I was going to ask, do you think there's a danger in overdiagnosing ADD and ADHD? Because there are a lot of people who think, it's not even a thing, and I would hate to go that far. But at the same time...
Why? You did in class.
Okay, no, what I'm saying, I wouldn't go that, you can't go that far, but there are a lot of people who think, you got these kids who are just being kids, and then you diagnose them and drug them, and who may show some symptoms, whether it's from environmental causes such as video games, and do we really know, and how do we go about determining that?
It's a very touchy one. And I don't know if I would say the danger necessarily is in over-diagnosing, but perhaps the over-medicating. It wouldn't be so bad to identify that a student has struggles with focus and figure out ways to help them with that. But where the danger lies is over-medicating. And some students that have problems with focus simply have problems with focus. They're not necessarily ADD or ADHD, but similar behavioral techniques could work with them both. There's very few students that I would say medication actually physiologically works for ADHD. Did I answer your question?
Nate?
Yeah, another part of that too is, maybe it's a different topic, that it becomes a crutch for them as well. And how do we avoid it becoming a crutch? I still have a picture of the second grade girl out the hallway eating her classmate's cupcake and looking at me with big eyes and saying, "It's the medication."
Yeah. You have to be very diligent about explaining to them that there is a reason but not an excuse for their behaviors. I have had a student say to me, well, I'm not on my meds today, but I'm like, that doesn't give you a ticket for just a free-for-all. You then need to work extra hard at trying other things to control and she has ADHD. So always, and a lot of times scripture is helpful with that too.
If there are no other comments, then I'd like to thank you, Lori, very much. Appreciate it. Next on the agenda, I will I will read off the names of those that have Title V presentations. These presentations are displayed in the art room, which is out in the hall, all the way down to the right, correct?
Yes.
All right. So I'll read your name. If you do not need to say anything, just shake your head like this. If you'd like to talk, you have